The smell of fresh coffee and maple syrup should have been comforting. It wasn't. James stepped through the sliding doors of Ridgeline Station, the kind of place that existed in every mid-sized Canadian city, half food court, half transit hub, the hum of fluorescent lights mixing with the drone of PA announcements overhead. He wore his civvies, worn jeans, a gray Henley boots. Nothing that screamed anything about who he was or what he did, except for Atlas. The German shepherd walked at his left heel with the quiet precision of a dog that had never known anything but purpose. 90 pounds of muscle and instinct, eyes that swept the room the way James's did. In grids, in patterns, missing nothing. Atlas wore his service vest, the patches clean and legible. Military working dog. Do not pet. James had 14 days of leave. He'd spent the first 4 at his sister's place outside Kelowna. Then she'd gotten a work call. Something about a project in Calgary. And the house had gotten too quiet, the way houses do when your brain hasn't learned to stop running threat assessments. So he'd driven east, no particular plan, and ended up here. Ridgeline Station, somewhere between Kamloops and wherever he decided to go next. He found a table near the back wall. Force of habit. Clear sightlines to all 3 exits, back against something solid. Atlas settled beneath the table without being told, chin resting on his front paws, eyes still moving. James picked up the laminated menu. He wasn't particularly hungry. He ordered anyway. Routine was its own kind of discipline. There are men who learn to be still, not because the world stopped moving around them, but because they trained themselves, piece by piece, to go quiet on the inside no matter what was happening on the outside. James Whitfield was one of those men. 14 years in the Navy, the last 8 in the teams, and he had learned that the men who panic are the ones who weren't paying attention before the moment arrived. He was paying attention now. The waitress who came to his table was young, early 20s, name tag reading Bev, and she looked at Atlas with the particular brightness of someone who loved dogs and had enough professionalism to check herself before reaching out. "He's beautiful," she said. "Can I?" "Better not," James said, not unkindly. "He's working." Bev nodded, recovering smoothly. "What can I get you?" "Coffee black, eggs over easy, brown toast." She wrote it down. "He okay under there?" "I can bring water, he'd appreciate that." She left. James watched the room. Mid-morning, not peak hours, maybe 30 people scattered across the food court. A family with 2 kids near the window, 3 older men at a round table, coffee cups between them, newspapers folded, a woman in her 50s on a laptop, transit workers in high-vis vests eating breakfast, a teenager in headphones staring at his phone. Normal, all of it normal. Atlas shifted under the table. James glanced down. The dog hadn't moved much, just a small repositioning of weight, chin lifting slightly off his paws. His nose was working. James watched him and said nothing, the same way you don't interrupt someone who's reading. Bev came back with the coffee and a bowl of water, which she placed carefully beside the table without making a production of it. James appreciated that. "Busy morning?" he asked. "Boozier than usual," she said. "There's a tournament at the arena, hockey. Lot of families coming through." She left him to it. James drank his coffee. It was good, dark roast, not the burnt stuff. He hadn't expected that. Atlas shifted again. The man came in around the same time the eggs arrived. James noticed him the way he noticed everyone. Cataloged, filed, moved on. Mid-40s. Cocky chinos, a blue blazer that was doing its best. Lanyard with a facility ID badge. Broad shoulders running to soft, the kind of build that had once been athletic and was now managerial. He moved through the food court with his chin up and his eyes busy. The unconscious surveillance of someone who believed this space belonged to him. His name, James would later learn, was Douglas Pruitt, Deputy Director of Operations for Ridgeline Transit Authority. He had held that title for 4 years and had spent most of that time ensuring that Ridgeline Station ran according to his particular vision of order. Douglas stopped walking when he saw Atlas. James watched him stop, watched him take stock of the situation, the table, the man in civvies, the large dog in a service vest. Watched something move behind his eyes that James recognized, the decision being made before any fact-finding had occurred. Douglas walked over. "Excuse me." He didn't make it a question. "Is that animal yours?" "He is," James said. "This is a food service area. Animals aren't permitted." James set down his fork. He kept his voice even. "He's a certified military working dog. Service animals are permitted in all public areas under the Canadian Human Rights Act." Douglas looked at Atlas the way some people look at a parking ticket, an inconvenience that had the bad taste to be legal. "That may be, but I'll need to see documentation." James reached into the front pocket of his bag and produced the credentials. He always carried them. He'd learned early that the kind of person who asked for documentation was also the kind of person who needed it to be in a laminated sleeve with an official seal. Douglas studied the papers. His jaw moved slightly, the way jaws do when a person is searching for the exception and not finding it. "This says he's a Navy dog," Douglas said. "Military working dog," James said. "Yes. Are you military?" "I am." Douglas handed the papers back. He didn't apologize. He looked at Atlas once more, then at James and said, "Keep him under the table." "He's under the table." "Keep him there." He walked away. James watched him go, then picked up his fork again. Atlas had not moved. The dog's eyes tracked Douglas across the room with the flat patience of a sensor array. There are people who leave a space feeling smaller after they move through it. Not because of what they say, exactly, but because of what they make you aware of. That you are being measured, and the measurement has already been decided. James had met those people before, in many different uniforms. He had learned to let them pass through his awareness the way weather passes, noted, accounted for, not dwelt upon. Atlas, on the other hand, kept watching. James finished his eggs. He was considering a second cup of coffee when Atlas moved. Not dramatically. No barking, no sudden lunge. Just the quiet, deliberate motion of a dog that had made a decision. Atlas rose from beneath the table, turned 90 degrees, and began walking toward the far end of the food court. James was on his feet before the movement completed. "Atlas. Heel." The dog stopped, looked back at James with an expression that, in 14 years of working together, 4 years with Atlas specifically, James had come to recognize it wasn't disobedience, it was information. James walked to him, crouched down. "Show me." Atlas turned and continued walking, slower now, James at his shoulder. They moved past the occupied tables, the old men with their newspapers, the family with the hockey kids, toward a maintenance corridor on the far wall. The corridor was closed off by a retractable belt barrier, the kind used to route foot traffic. Beyond it, a utility door propped slightly open and a row of large industrial waste bins. Atlas stopped at the barrier, sat, looked at the bins. James's hand went still at his side. He knew that sit. Every handler knew that sit. It was the trained final response, the signal that said, "Here, specifically here, something is wrong." James straightened. He pulled out his phone. Douglas appeared as if summoned by the worst possible timing. "Sir," his voice had the temperature of a January morning. "I asked you to keep the animal at your table. I need you to call your security team," James said. He kept his voice low. "Right now, I beg your pardon? Your maintenance corridor. Those bins." James didn't point. Pointing created panic. "My dog has given a final response. That means he's detected something. Chemical, explosive, narcotics. I don't know which. But he doesn't give false alerts." Douglas stared at him. Then Douglas looked at Atlas, sitting perfectly still at the barrier, and looked back at James and made the decision he would spend a long time thinking about. "Sir, your dog sat down near a garbage area and you're telling me there's a bomb. I'm telling you Atlas flagged it. I'd like you to take that seriously." "I'd like you," Douglas said, "to return to your table before I have you removed from the premises." James looked at him for one moment. Just one. The kind of look that doesn't argue and doesn't threaten because it doesn't need to. "Call your security team," James said again. "Please, I'm going to need you to step back." The security guard who arrived 2 minutes later was named Perry. He was 26, with the build of someone who had just graduated from a training program and hadn't yet learned the difference between authority and certainty. He put his hand on James's shoulder before he finished his opening sentence. "Sir, I'm going to need you to—" "Don't," James said quietly. Perry removed his hand. Something in the tone communicated itself clearly. "Douglas says you're making a disturbance," Perry said, recalibrating. "I'm not making anything." My dog flagged that corridor. James kept his eyes on the maintenance area. "I'm a Navy SEAL. I have 14 years of service. This dog has been trained by the Canadian Armed Forces for 6 of those years. He does not sit unless there is a reason." Perry looked at Atlas. Atlas had not moved from his seated position at the barrier. He was the calmest thing in the building. "Sir, this is a transit hub, not a—" "Transit hubs are targets," James said. "High foot traffic, multiple entry and exit points, difficult to secure. If you won't call it in, I'm calling it in myself." Douglas stepped forward. "If you make that call, I will have you arrested for public mischief." The room had gone quiet in the way that rooms do when they're pretending not to listen. James looked at Douglas. Then he looked at Perry. Then he looked at the 30-odd people in the food court who were all, in their various ways, paying careful attention. He took a breath. The voice came from the round table where the 3 older men had been sitting with their coffee and newspapers. "I want to know what's in that corridor." The man who'd spoken was probably 70. Maybe a little past it. White hair, a flannel shirt, and the kind of hands that had done physical work for most of their life. He had pushed back from his table and was standing with the unhurried certainty of someone who had stopped caring about making scenes several decades ago. His name was Walter. No, not Walter. His name was Edmund Brassard. Retired from CN Rail, 41 years of service, the last 12 as a track safety inspector. He knew what industrial spaces smelled like, and he knew what it looked like when a trained animal found something. "The dog sat down," Edmund said. "My grandson has a service dog. You learn what it means when they sit like that." Douglas turned to him. "Sir, this is none of your—" "I'm a citizen in a public building," Edmund said, with the patience of someone repeating a sentence he'd already said once. "And I'm telling you that if that man says his dog found something, I believe him." Douglas opened his mouth. "Call it in," said one of Edmund's friends at the table. A man with a gray beard and a veterans organization pin on his jacket lapel. The room had weight now, not panic. Something more measured than panic. The specific gravity of people who have collectively decided they are not moving until something is done. Perry looked at Douglas. Douglas looked at the room. Douglas took out his radio. The RCMP arrived in 11 minutes. The bomb disposal unit from CFB Esquimalt was 23 minutes behind them. In that time, James stayed where he was, not at the barrier, not escalating, just standing near Atlas. One hand resting loosely on the dog's shoulder, the pair of them as still and settled as the center of something. The food court was evacuated quietly. Bev, the waitress, moved people out with a kind of calm efficiency that suggested she'd done emergency drills and actually paid attention. The hockey families. The laptop woman. The teenager in headphones, who looked mildly put out and then alarmed once he read the room. Edmund walked out last, pausing beside James on his way to the exit. "Thank you for your service, son," he said. He didn't make it a production. He just said it and kept walking. James didn't say anything. He gave a small nod. That was enough. The device was in the 3rd bin. A package, the disposal team would later describe it publicly as an improvised incendiary device. Contained, non-detonated, tucked beneath 2 layers of maintenance waste. Not military grade, the work of someone who had read instructions online and followed them imperfectly. But it was real. The mechanism was functional. If it had gone off inside a food court during a transit rush, it would have done damage. Atlas had flagged it from 30 feet away. James learned the details afterward, sitting on a bench outside the evacuated building with Atlas at his feet, and a disposable coffee cup that had gone cold in his hand. A corporal from the RCMP, young, professional, clearly trying not to make the interaction feel like what it was, took his statement. James gave it plainly, the timeline, the response, where Atlas had sat, what he'd said to Douglas. The corporal looked up from his notebook at that part. and the deputy director refused to call it in. He did, James said. How many times did you ask? 3 times. Before Perry got involved. The corporal wrote something down that he didn't read aloud. Douglas was still on site, speaking to 2 senior RCMP officers in a way that had, over the past 20 minutes, gradually lost its original confidence. James didn't watch it happen. He didn't need to. Perry came and found him, eventually. I should have listened, Perry said. He looked like he was 22 again, which James suspected was closer to how he actually felt. I'm sorry. You didn't know, James said. Now you do. That was also enough. There are things that trained dogs understand that trained humans sometimes forget. Not because dogs are smarter, but because dogs have never learned to second-guess what their senses tell them. Atlas did not wonder if it was his place to speak up. He did not calculate the social cost of being wrong. He found a thing. He sat down. He waited. That, in the end, is all it took. The Transit Authority issued a statement at 4 p.m. that day. It thanked law enforcement and did not mention James or Atlas by name. Edmund Brassard, interviewed briefly by a CBC reporter on the sidewalk outside, mentioned them both by name. Without hesitation, to a camera that ended up on the local 6 o'clock news. A young fellow in there with a military dog, Edmund said. The dog knew. The man said so clearly, and they didn't want to hear it. He looked at the camera. We were lucky those 2 walked in for breakfast. James didn't see the broadcast. He and Atlas were already back on the highway, heading east, no particular destination. The thermos in the cup holder was full. Atlas was asleep across the back seat, head on his paws, legs twitching slightly in whatever dogs dream about. It was a good afternoon for driving. James had 10 days of leave left. He thought he might go as far as Calgary after all. I want to tell you what I think about. When I think about that morning in Ridgeline Station, I don't think about the device or the statistics or the procedures that did or didn't work. I think about the moment, James said. Show me. And the dog turned around and led him there. No argument, no hesitation. Just movement and certainty, and an animal that had never been given any reason to doubt what its own body was telling it. I think about Edmund Brassard pushing back from his table, 70 years old, a cup of coffee going cold, and he stood up. Not because he knew James, not because he was certain, but because he looked at a dog sitting still in a specific spot, and he thought, someone taught that dog something, and that dog is telling us that is the thing in the end. Not the headlines, not the close call, not the bureaucratic accounting that followed. Just a man who showed up, a dog who never stopped working, and an old man who decided at 70 that he still had something to say. Some days that is exactly enough.